Super fun to be back again today with Ryan, kind of a continuation of our previous conversations, but we're going to be talking a little bit about a study that Ryan has been reading about the control theory of free energy and how it works hierarchically. And as I read through the abstract, it sounded like to me like the authors were making an argument for the necessity of a hierarchy of values. So we'll see how this works out as we talk. And Ryan, I'm going to let you introduce, since you're the one that found the paper.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Karen. Yeah, I wanted to go through this paper in particular with you, Karen, because I felt like, we had our last conversation that was like kind of feeling through a lot of kind of connected ideas, and I was kind of like giving my vague understanding of how they might fit together. And then I found this where this guy is saying all that stuff and showing how it fits together in a very systematic way, which I thought was really cool. And so I just kind of wanted to start exploring that. But first, I wanted to show something because a lot of this is based on something called control theory, which people might be familiar with from like robotics or computation or whatever. Like it has a lot of applications, and it's from like kind of early mid 20th century. So it's been around for a while. But if I could, I wanted to just share a video to kind of start off with to help understand the control theory stuff. Okay, so are you seeing YouTube?
Yes, I am.
Okay, so what's going on here is there's two markers, like two different people with two markers, and they're tied together by a rubber band, right? And then there's a dot in the center of the page. And so the person on the right with the blue marker is just drawing whatever they feel like. The person on the left with the green marker has been told to do something very particular. Okay. And so first I'm just going to play the video. And so again, the blue marker is making their own decisions. Green is responding in some manner to those decisions. Okay. Okay. So you can kind of see what's going on. Like off the top of your head, what would your guess be about what green is trying to do?
Trying to do either copy or do exactly the opposite of what the other guy is doing. It
Right.
looks like it's upside down and backwards, like a mirror image, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like mirrored in both directions or whatever. So what's interesting is the instruction that the green marker person was given was, you see there's this little knot in the rubber band. All they're trying to do is keep that knot on top of the little dot on the page.
Oh, interesting. They're not
Yeah.
trying, because I was thinking it would be very hard to do a backwards and upside down mirror image,
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And so watch it again real quick and just pay attention now that you know that that's what's happening, see kind of what's going on. Right. So the blue person moves around and the green is just trying to do that. Okay.
Fascinating.
Right. It's interesting. Even without knowing how this applies to anything, it's like, huh, that's a really interesting thing, right?
Yeah.
And so this is just a little demonstration that they use when describing what's called perceptual control theory, which is taking control theory and applying it to perception, right? And this guy Warren Mansell, he's a psychologist, and that's more of kind of his angle. And so the idea is, we tend to think of like ourselves as, um, we take an input and then we decide what action to take because, we want to take actions in the world or whatever. But control theory has a slightly different perspective. In some ways, it's kind of an upside down perspective. But the idea is our behaviors are merely attempts to modify our perceptions. Basically, what we're ultimately trying to do is receive certain inputs. We don't actually care that much what's going on out there, but we want to receive certain inputs. And what we're doing is just trying to take behaviors, take actions that will modify the inputs that are then going to get sent to us so that those inputs can match what we want them to be, essentially.
So it's
Okay.
a kind of higher level homeostasis.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like a kind of homeostasis, like so in this case, it's like the person doesn't care what they're drawing. The drawing is irrelevant in terms of what they're focused on, right? What they're actually focused on is keep that knot in the rubber band on top of the dot. Keep that perception over the expected perception, if that makes sense, right?
Well, but so how does Mansell explain the idea that there is a guy with a blue marker?
Right.
There's not only a green marker that's working to keep a certain homeostasis, but there is a blue marker that's making the original pattern.
Yeah, and so yeah, so let me go over to the paper because exactly. So within a frame, within one little perspective of this, you've got some kind of input and you don't know where that came from. And you can't say where that came from.
Mm-hmm.
All you can say is, okay, there's some kind of input to the system. And the basic idea is that you have this, or let me show,
So
let
the
me go over
blue
the paper.
marker is the input to the system.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And so the idea is here. I mean, this is essentially what we were just looking at, right? And so it's like the blue marker is like, okay, that's the thing that's happening. This is the control or the dot, right? And then I have the output, right? And then this is my decision that influences the environment or whatever, right? And so the idea is that this is kind of the flow of stuff through a a decision-making system or a system that is attempting to control. And control in this context is, again, just trying to keep the knot over the dot. Okay.
Which would that line up with Friston's idea of trying to minimize surprisal?
Yeah. And um, Friston and the whole free energy thing is very much related to this because basically the difference between where the dot is and where the knot is, that's surprise in
Mm-hmm.
Friston's in the way Friston frames things, right? And so
Well,
this,
and that's why you get the variation in the green line.
right,
You
exactly.
get subtle variations in the green line because of that distance.
Right, exactly. And so it's attempting to reduce that, Friston would call this the free energy of the system. It's like you're trying to reduce that, right? Within perceptual control theory, it's very similar. I mean, these ideas map onto each other really well, right? But they don't think of it in terms of energy. They just think of it in terms of like the system is attempting to control its perceptions, if that makes sense.
Okay, I'm going to put a pin in something here that we can talk about later.
Okay.
The subtle variations are what make the image much more interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so we can talk about that later.
Yeah, there's something to that for sure.
Okay.
And I think we'll probably end up circling back to this several times. Um, but okay, so imagine that this is generally what's happening, you know, and I'm kind of just taking that as a given for the rest of the conversation, if
Yeah.
that's okay. Like I'm not really like,
Yeah, this is a
and
model.
yeah,
This is
it's
not
just
life.
a
This
way
is
to
just a
try to make
model.
some stuff.
Yeah.
Um, and so you've also got, okay, it's like, where does this control value come from? Like, where does the dot come from? Right? That's a big question in this, right? Um, and so if you kind of look through what he's talking about here, you get down to this. And
Wait a
so,
minute. It's not just, it's the dot and the knot.
yes,
Both come from someplace.
yeah, and I
Okay.
think that's a good point actually because I really like the rubber band analogy because it involves tension, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because imagine like, okay, like you don't have like we're not just like one of these. Imagine like we have this, but like a whole bunch of them, And so imagine like let's say I'm driving my car down the highway, right? And I'm trying to control a bunch of things. Like there's various dots that I care about, and there's various knots in the
Mhm.
rubber band, so to speak, right? Like one of those is I don't like people tailing me. I get kind of stressed when people tail me, right?
Mhm.
And so I'm paying attention to that perception of like how close are people to me, right?
Mhm.
Let's say someone comes up and they get a little closer than I want. They exceed my threshold of where I'm comfortable, right? Well, now I've got a decision to make, right? I can change that perception by speeding up or getting over a lane, right? Because
Mhm.
then it's like, okay, now I'm back to perceiving what I want to perceive, which is that no one is too close to me, right? But the problem is we don't just have one of these things in our system. We've got lots of them, right? And
Mhm.
so I've got that one control system, which is I want to perceive that people are not too close to me. But I've got another control system that's like, well, I want to perceive myself as a strong person who's not letting people push me around, you know?
Mhm.
And these things might be in competition with each other, right? And so it's like if someone starts tailing me and I just choose to get over a lane, that might upset this other control system, which is like, well, I don't want to feel like I'm just getting bullied by people on the road, right?
Mhm.
And so what happens when you've got two control systems that are at an equivalent level that are trying to produce two different outputs, right? The part of me that's like, I want to get over lane because I want to perceive that no one's too close to me. And this other one's like, no, I want to stay where I am because I want to perceive that I'm strong. You know?
Mhm.
What if they're both basically equally producing the same desired result that are in two opposite directions? Now you've got this kind of unresolvable oscillation between things, right?
I can tell you what my husband does in that situation.
Right. Well, and so this is what's cool.
He
It's like,
slows down,
yeah, right. Yeah, which is like it's another way to
push the
perceive.
stress onto the guy in the back.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Or you can think of it too in terms of like, a driver and a passenger. Like they are in dialogue in some manner, about what's happening. Let's say
Mhm.
you're kind of stereotypical um aggressive driver, aggressive man driver, you know, with your stereotypical kind of like safer female driver, right?
Mhm.
They're going to be again they've got their control systems and they're interacting with each other, right? And now you've got these tensions between potentially conflicting desired perceptions, right? And so what you can start to see is that this is a really generic pattern, or the author of this paper calls it a motif. It's a motif that can apply at many different scales, in many different contexts, right? To help make sense of a lot of phenomena, right?
Mhm. So we're going to look at the paper. Do you have it or should I bring it up?
I can just pull it up if that's
Okay.
okay. And so imagine, okay, like we talked about, like you've got a whole bunch of, so like this little tripart thing right here, that's like one little control, like unit of control or whatever, right? And you've got a whole bunch of them, right? The question still remains is where do those dots come from, right? Like what's going on with like where do those desired states come from? What's deciding that?
Mhm.
And within this frame, he's actually arguing like, okay, well, imagine you've got many layers of this thing happening, right? Where I've got kind of my bottom layer, which might be like my just basic raw inputs to the system. But then what if you add another layer on top? So like that could be like this layer right here. And what if you kind of had those interact with each other, where like the outputs of this layer became the control for the lower layer, right? And so now basically the you can think of it like the desired state of the lower layer is being determined by the upper layer, right? There's something above that's making the decision about what ought to be, right? And so you
Mhm.
have this oughtness that's descending from above. But then that layer has another layer above it, and there's an oughtness descending from up there, right?
Mhm.
And theoretically you could just keep doing that and keep doing that, right? And then as the different layers are interacting with each other, it's not just that like there's a one-to-one thing. Like it's not just these two. It's like the output of this will become the oughtness for maybe this one and this one and this one and this one, right? And so now you've got information that's starting to sort of bleed together, and these little units of control are feeding into each other, not only at different layers, but also, one decision might influence multiple different things, right? And this is happening going up and going down,
Well,
right?
so that's why this paper is unusual, right? Because most of the time, the materialists start with the bottom layer and say that all the influence is coming from there moving up.
Yes.
Like, and I don't want to misrepresent Mark Solms, but his idea of where consciousness comes from is you take that bottom layer and all of the homeostasis functions from the bottom layer are actually what produces consciousness. But
Mhm.
this picture is saying that there has to be a layer up for the bottom layer to function at all. And so you've got these layers
Right.
down, up and back, up and
Yeah.
down.
Yeah. And so it's like the only way any of this works at all is if you if you already have higher layers that are producing um desired outcomes, right?
Okay.
Yeah. And so if you kind of keep going through this, you can start to see he goes from there
There
and
was
talks.
okay, there's a part just before section 3. Could you scroll? Did I, yeah, on this page, right here. So I can't remember where I found that section. Maybe scroll down a little bit more on this page. Okay, yeah, somewhere in here is where I started taking notes.
Okay.
It's really good stuff. Very interesting. Well, keep going. I'll find my notes.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, whenever you find it, just interrupt me. Um, because yeah, I mean there's a lot here. Like I'm just showing the diagrams because that's easier to grasp, But he starts talking about these things called small world networks, which basically is like given any network, like imagine like a whole bunch of people on the internet. Like we don't all interact with like not every person interacts with every other person, right? Like that's just not sustainable, right?
Mm-hmm.
There ends up being little clumps and clusters based on whatever is sustainable. And it seems that that pattern is kind of inevitable, you know, no matter what kind of networks you're looking at. These little like organic networks, what will emerge is that same thing, little clusters, right? And then if you start looking at that, you'll see the same thing on different levels of abstraction. So you can see like um, a big cluster made up of little things, but then if you kind of zoom into those, it'll be the same thing. That's made up of a bunch of little clusters, and you can keep kind of doing that all the way down. That's the idea, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know a ton about how these work or where they come from or whatever. I just know that it's kind of integral to the model. But the point is that, I mean, this emerges because it's the most efficient way to do things, right? And I think that's kind of crucial to understanding what these authors are trying to argue is that all of this is emergent from their perspective because it is the most efficient way to do information processing that actually accomplishes things in the world. Okay.
Yeah, I heard a really interesting lecture on this connectome idea a couple of years ago. I was going to do an episode on it, and then I got buried by a bunch of other episodes and I lost track of it. But I'll try to go back and find that guy because he was super interesting.
Really?
He probably is, right in the center of this thing.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That whatever you have that's related to this, I'd be curious about because like this is all pretty new to me, you know?
Mm-hmm.
It was just so exciting to discover like, wow, someone else is I mean, people are making sense of stuff in ways that make sense. according to like our conversations, you know?
Mhm.
And so you can take that small net. This is basically just a visualization of what we were just talking about, where you've got like the main thing that is like a little cluster, and then that's a little cluster. This is almost like a fractal
Mhm.
of that network hierarchy, right? And what you can see is like, okay, this is starting to look like, you know, in our last conversation, I was trying to describe like that fractal tetrahedron of, you know, the layers of abstraction in a network that's processing information. That's essentially what this is. I mean, that's exactly what this is, right? It's,
Mhm.
you know, it's not, I don't think he's arguing that there's always going to be like six at each layer or whatever. Although that might be true. It might be that that is the most efficient, you know, way to do it, but I'm not sure if he argues that in this paper.
Well, I
Uh,
mean, that's what it turns out to be with like beehives and stuff, right? The
right. Yeah.
hexagonal shape is pretty key.
Yeah, like I think there probably is something to that, and you know, that feeds into like Gabe Stuckey's work with the kind of trying to understand these types of things geometrically, you know.
Uh-huh.
And so there's a lot there that I want to explore. I don't know it yet, you know. And so if you go from there, now he starts talking about this thing he calls the bow tie or hourglass motif. And the idea is that, you know, or let's say you just had a whole bunch of like that first diagram I showed where it was like a layer of controls and a layer of controls and a layer of controls all the way up, right?
Mm-hmm.
If it was just a flat, like just all the way up, then you would have information feeding around, but it wouldn't like, you would never be compressing it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But this is an illustration of like, well, through these networks, this is actually how information can get compressed, right? Because as you're going,
Has to get compressed.
it
Yeah.
has to. It's
Uh-huh.
inevitable, right? Because like if you weren't doing that, then nothing would happen, basically, as far as I can tell, right? But
Yep.
there's something about, you know, as you go up this hierarchy, you have or this hierarchy of small world networks or whatever. I don't know the language for it, but like as you go up, you have fewer at each kind of level, right? And then once you get to kind of the highest level, you know, this like center, then you can go back down from there and do the same thing down, right? And so what happens is you end up taking all the raw information, compressing it in these control structures all the way up, and then decompressing it back down to end up with outputs, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
each little input and output is kind of in some manner being influenced by the entire system each time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you can visualize that with this bow tie thing, right?
Well, I mean, it's that chiastic structure that we talk about so often,
Hmm.
and it's the structure of so many things. Like, for example, just take a this is kind of a high level structure, but let's say take me.
Hmm.
I'm going to make a painting, and I have this whole thing in my head that's just too massive to manage. And a lot of things have to be happening to get all the way down to the place where I put a stroke of paint on the painting. And then over time, those strokes proliferate and become more and more and more. And so you start out with this whole big thing up here. It
Hmm.
goes down through me and gets compressed and then turns up on the canvas going out the other way until that whole thing has been
Yep.
compressed into an idea and then manifested again in the physical world on that piece of canvas. And that happens when you're writing a program. That happens, right? When you're making any sort of a judgment in life, you have
Hmm.
all this stuff that's going on as you're making this judgment. And then you've got to go through this narrow chute and then get out the other side in order to see the result, the consequence.
Yeah. And if you weren't doing that, it wouldn't like I can't conceive of how it would be possible, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
you're having to take this enormous amount of information and compress it down to something you can manage, right?
Right.
And that's kind of what's happening as you're moving towards the center here. But also what's going to happen is, you are compressing it. And so if I have like a massive, like let's say I took all of Google Maps where I could see every little mailbox and every little thing, and I compress it down to just a world map where I can't really zoom in anymore. Well, now I can make sense of the whole world, but I can't make sense of all the little stuff at each spot, right? But there's so much you can do with it now that you have the whole picture, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I imagine, as an artist, I mean that you're doing this probably kind of constant dance between the minute and the whole picture, and you're kind of doing this back and forth thing constantly, right?
Well, yeah, and the other side of that is that the larger you make a painting, the more you have to think about finding a way to fill every inch of the painting with some, like if you make a very small painting, you can make something super simple, very, very abstracted and simple, and it will still be very interesting. But as the painting gets larger and larger and larger, in order to keep the attention, the focus on it, there has to be something that keeps your eye in the frame. So you have to think about more details. And so your Google Maps thing of the whole universe or whatever, right, has all those details in it. But then when you bring it down to the world map, you don't need all the details in order to manifest the frame.
Right.
All you need is that smaller picture so
Yeah.
that you can capture the whole thing at one time. Yeah, that's good.
And so where this is headed, it's like now that you've got all this, you can start to kind of, okay, connect it back to the control thing we were talking about, where you've got this kind of dialogue between my perception and my desired perception. And it's like, okay, what if, in a sense, this is kind of what our minds are doing? We're taking all the raw information and we're filtering it through these layers of little control units, which is basically a dialogue between what we're seeing and what we want to see, right? And you've got essentially two sides to it. That's kind of what's being represented here. It's right. It's like you this is where it starts to get fuzzy for me, and I wanted to kind of talk with you about it because
Mm-hmm.
in my head, what this is, or sorry, let me scroll down a bit and show another diagram. I think it might be more helpful to talk about this diagram. Because I think essentially what he's implying here is you can start to see like, oh, this looks like kind of the structure of the brain, right? Like we've got the two hemispheres, and we've got this kind of central area that's the hub of communication between them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, or like we were talking about in I think our last conversation, like if you've got your right hand and your left hand, and if you're right-handed and you're kind of mapping all of your experiences to that, that's going to become more your model of self. And then the other might become more your model of other, right? And you can start to see that sort of thing emerging here, where it's like, oh, if you have this dialogue between these two sides that are both doing the same thing, like you can almost think of it as two distinct individuals that are taking their raw information and compressing it down to something so that they can dialogue about it in the middle, so that then they can come to some kind of shared agreement about it and then take that back out into the world and make sense and take actions and make sense of things, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what he's saying here is if one of those is more external focused and one of them is more internal focused, basically what you've got is one individual is going out into the world and one individual is staying in making sense of it. And they're both like the one going out into the world is actually perceiving the world, but the one that's staying in and making sense internally is still building up a mental model of the world, but based on what it's heard from the one that's actually going out, if that makes sense. And so now you can start to see how like this can apply with like left and right, but it can also apply with like external focused and internal focused, like
Mm-hmm.
like this motif can just pop up and make sense of so many different things where you've got, but fundamentally what it is this triangle or this little um hierarchy of compressed perception, and you need two of them dialoguing together. And there's some magic about that dialogue that actually allows any of this to do something meaningful, right?
Yep. I mean, it's a very clear picture of marriage.
Yeah.
Um, and so many things pop into my mind, and I don't even know if they're okay to say. So
Sure.
um, I'm just thinking about, like, years ago, one of the models that somebody showed me was a triangle with the husband and wife at the bottom 2 points of the triangle and God at the top, and that as each of them get closer to God, then they are all at the same time getting closer to each other. So the closer they get to God, the closer they are to each other. So to your goal, the way to get closer to each other is to keep your eyes on God and keep
Mhm.
moving towards God. And then that will draw you closer to each other just naturally.
Right.
But that's a pretty good picture for communication, actually. If you
Yeah.
keep your eyes on the goal of the maximum unity of this communication together, then the closer you get to that goal of unity, the closer the more compressed the information is going to become, so that I'm simplifying and making more accessible the jumble of thoughts that are in my head, so that I can transfer them over to the other person
Right.
in that simplified, accessible way. But then once we reach that point together, then we have to start unraveling the parts that are not accessible and not understandable. So that's
Mhm.
why it's always going from the top back down to the bottom again and then back up again, because
Yeah.
you can't just pass over the simplified model. You have to unwind it when it gets to the other side.
Hmm.
And that is also a shared task.
Yeah. And yeah, and so it makes me think of like language, you
Mm-hmm.
know,
Mm-hmm.
because I
Yep.
mean that's part of what you're talking about, right? It's like you have to adopt
People
some kind
speaking from two different languages run into the same problem.
right. And or even shared like language in a very abstract sense, like shared images, shared patterns, shared rituals, like
Mm-hmm.
that's all going to be contained in this little kind of green area. If you're talking like, let's say blue and red here is two different people or two different communities, you know, or two
Mm-hmm.
different traditions, you know. It's like this motif is how all communication in information processing networks is happening. And I mean that's a brain, and that's a family, and that's a community, and that's a world, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you can even think of it in terms of like, you know, take this hourglass thing and or the take the bow tie and turn it into an hourglass, and now you've got like heaven and earth, right? It's like we're down here trying to make sense of things as best we can, and God is coming down to us, and you know, there's a meeting in the middle, and so it's like, how does that happen? It can't be God telling us everything about reality as he knows it. It has to be compressed down to something that we can make sense of. You know,
Mm-hmm.
we are so limited, right? And so it's like
Mm-hmm.
we have to hear from God and think about heavenly things in terms of these compressed ideas. Like there's because that's just how communication works, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, and the interesting thing is too that it's where the shared section is, the green part,
Hmm.
that doesn't mean that you have to get down to like the lowest common denominator between the two sides or anything like that. It's not like saying that all specificity disappears in that central part, because you can still see clearly that the hexagon is still there. There's
Right.
still all these different factors going on.
Yeah.
But you've just attempted to clarify as much as possible to get to a place where you have a simpler model to be able to transfer the information to each other.
Right.
Yeah, I like that. Where, I mean, some of what happens in the world when we think about two sides coming together is they draw this circle in the middle and they say, this is where we all agree on this is the least amount that we can agree on, right? And
Right.
or it turns into some kind of mushy compromise situation, but that's not, I don't think that's what this is saying at all.
Right. Yeah, and then if each side had the humility, like let's say both of these are experiencing the world, but clearly they're receiving different inputs. And if they both have the humility and the trust to say, okay, that other side is hearing different stuff, and I trust that other side, so I genuinely am interested in what that other side has to say, so that, you know, like two are better than one, basically.
Mhm.
You know, if the blue side just says, well, I see what I see and I care about what I see and I don't care about what the red side sees, well, that's not going to be an effective way to move in the world, right?
Mhm.
And I kind of wonder if this maps onto how Peterson talks about, like, you really need a left and a right, politically and semantically.
Mhm.
You need a
Yeah.
masculine and a
Yeah.
feminine. Or I mean, and this is kind of like a lot of what Gabe Stuckey's working on. Is like you need this balancing thing happens, and it kind of needs to happen in every realm of our being in order for us to stay healthy. And I think this is how I'm starting to make sense of how that balancing actually happens, you know. And I think what these authors are arguing is this isn't just kind of randomly how the brain developed, from an evolutionary perspective. Like it's inevitably how the brain developed because this is inevitably the pattern of communication in reality at every scale, right? These things
One of the things that Friston says that always scales up in my brain is that um, no matter how simple an organism is, it has to have within itself a model of its external environment. Otherwise, it can't function.
right. Yep. And
Well,
I think that's
you're
kind of what
saying a
these are.
lot when you're saying that the model of the external environment already exists, no matter how simple the organism is, or it can't function. That's
Mhm.
the dot, right? It has to be there.
Yeah. And it, it's like, as far as I can tell, what these authors are talking about is that's the blue and the red here in terms of external and internal. Like you've
Mhm.
got like the red is like the mirrored map of things.
Mhm.
If you're going back to this, it's like one of these is moving in the world. Like let's say this is the body and this is the mind, maybe. Where the blue, the body is the one that's actually kind of moving out in the world, but then the green is responding to it in terms of, you know, I mean, this is where it gets hard for me to make sense of, but like there's this connection with the rubber band, which is the tension. And so the green can't move in the same way that blue is, but it's giving information back to blue by the tension and by the difference between, you know, where this is. And if you think of this as the free energy, or, the authors in this paper, they go on to basically say that this is what stress is. Stress is when we see a misalignment between what we perceive and what we desire to perceive, you know. And so you can imagine at lower levels in this system, like down here, a little bit of stress is no big deal. Like right now I'm sitting in my chair and like my posture's not like perfect, and so there's little stresses here and there, but all in all, it's like not a big deal. But like as you go up here and you start getting stress, you start getting things at the higher levels where the knot is not over the dot. Well, that's causing stress throughout the whole system now, right? And so the
Mhm.
consequences of that are much, much greater, and so that might be like if my perception of self is not what I want it to be, that might be something that gets all the way up to this level. Like if I am like, oh, I want to be a successful person, but I perceive that I'm not. Well, now there's this incongruency that's causing angst, and that angst is
Uh-huh.
stress in the system. And now, if that stress is happening up here, it's going to flow down to whatever is, because again, like going back to up here, like that becomes the desired, like, let's say that that's happening at this level up here, that becomes the output that is then influencing the control for a bunch of other things. And that will in turn influence the control for a bunch of other things. And so basically,
Well,
those, yeah, go ahead.
can't we bring this all back to Peterson's lobsters? Um, like if you go back to that other thing where you said something is stressed
Hmm.
at the central core of your being, like your sense of
Right,
self is stressed,
right.
that's going to affect a lot more things.
Yes.
But if if you can change your posture,
Hmm.
then that actually begins to rebuild some of the chemical structure that allows your sense of self to rebuild. So
Absolutely.
it comes from the bottom back up again.
Yeah. And there's a lot to unpack there, especially in, I mean, in terms of like the mind body stuff that we've talked about, right? Because, like imagine this is kind of a top down view of, let's say, a human body with the left and the right side.
Mm-hmm.
This is going to map onto like a top down view of the head and the spine and the central nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like the nervous system as it goes down the spine is a representation of these kind of layers,
Mm-hmm.
where the information from the legs is going to get passed up here and filtered into the information with the arms and then the neck and then all the way up. And then, that's almost like maybe that triangle of compression. And then now you've got the mind doing the same thing with its maps of the world getting mapped down to, okay, after all that information was fed through the spinal cord, it got here, and this is the highly compressed version of it. Okay, based on our map of the world and our perceptions about, where am I in the world and what am I hearing and what am I thinking and all that, how do I make sense of what I'm perceiving from this compressed information from the body, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like you're saying, I mean, if you have a conflict in that core, that's going to make you unstable. And these authors talk about, I mean, that's what stress in a system is.
Well, can we go back to the rubber band illustration? I want to ask you a question there.
Hmm.
Okay, so when the blue guy is pulling down to the lower right hand corner with the marker, um, the green guy is going to have to pull back in order to get the thing over the dot, right?
Hmm.
But then if the blue guy moves towards the dot, then the green guy has to move towards the dot as well in order to keep it over the dot.
Hmm.
So sometimes there is more tension to get it over the dot, and sometimes there's considerably less tension to get it over the dot.
Yeah.
So it's not always, the stress is not always a negative. The stress can sometimes be used to get the dot centered, and then a release of stress can sometimes be used to get the dot centered. Would that be
Yeah.
correct?
Well, yeah, I don't know because I have not yet mapped like what is the meaning of the rubber band in this analogy,
Mm-hmm.
because I think these authors of the paper would say, well, stress is just the difference this distance. I don't know what they would say about the tension in the
So
rubber.
tension and stress are not the same thing. Okay, I get it. I get it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, but I mean, to your point, it seems to be something about like you can only stretch that rubber band so far. Like it's gonna snap at some point.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if that maps onto this system somehow. I imagine it does, right? Because I think about it like you brought up marriage earlier. Like I think about it in terms of relationships. Like, let's say you've got someone who's just a really hardliner, like we are going to have that not over the dot always, no matter what. Well, they're going to create tons of tension. They won't care what's going on, right? They'll always be creating tension in that rubber band for the sake of being very, very dogmatic, right?
Mhm.
But what
Very
if that's not
dotmatic.
what
Very, very dotmatic.
dogmatic? Like that's funny. Yeah, and it's like, what if that's not the most loving thing to do? You
Uh,
know, what if maybe the better thing to do in some situations is let's create less tension in the rubber band at the consequence of being off of the dot, you know? And so I was talking about this with some friends the other day, and they brought up, the Old Testament. Like, God allows Israel to have a king, even though he says, like, I mean, that's not how this is supposed to go, but okay, here you go. And I wonder if that's kind of God lovingly saying, like, okay, like I could force this not to be over this dot, maybe that's exile,
mhm.
like maybe that's, I'm gonna stretch it back out to where it ought to be and you're gonna deal with it. But maybe other times he says, well, that's not what I'm gonna do right now. I'm gonna allow the knot to not be over the dot for the sake of not having tension and hope that you will clue in and pay attention. And it's almost like there's this dialogue between the the issue of control and the issue of tension, something like that. I don't yet know what that means, but that seems to be something in relationships. Like we're
Well, okay, so it has something to do with maturing, because, and was it this article where they're talking about maturation, the essay that you sent, or the
I don't
paper
know.
you sent me?
Let's see.
But it has something to do with maturation because
Yes.
the um, the Israelites wanted to go their own way. They didn't trust that God's way was the best. They want to go their own way. And so in doing that, they demand a king, and God could just deny them the king, right? But
Right.
if he did that, then they would never learn where they're off because they are off in their thinking. The only
Right.
way they can learn that they're off in their thinking is to follow through on their error and then discover how big the tension is, how big the stress is between what's correct and what's not correct. The only way you can learn to measure that distance is if you sometimes fall into error.
Right.
And when you do that, then you have a way of measuring that stress.
Right.
And and that's the only way you can mature. See, according to this model, organisms may differ in their susceptibility to tipping points as a result of individual differences in the outgrowth, the maturation of their regulatory hierarchies. So I think those tipping points have to do with, because there has to be freedom in the system. The only way there can be a tipping point is if there's freedom in the system. So
Right.
let me show you something that I found today that I thought was quite interesting.
Yeah. Do you need me to stop sharing?
Yeah, I'm going to share screen here. Once you quit, there we
Okay.
go. And this was a video that I saw. What? Well, let me put it on there. Okay, Safari. Can you see video now?
Yes.
Okay. This will stop other person screen sharing. Do you want to continue? Continue. What's it doing now? Okay. So this is a video that just popped up on my algorithm today.
Nice.
And it's kind of a review of a book that was written back in 2012 by a guy named Adrian Bajan, and it's called Constructal Theory.
Interesting. Okay.
And I think you can see on the screen here. It says for a finite size flow system to persist in time or to live, its configuration must evolve in such a way that provides easier access to the currents that flow through it. Everything that moves, whether animate or inanimate, is a flow system. Now I'm going to play 1 minute of this video.
And in terms of what it means to live, he says everything that moves, whether animate or inanimate, is a flow system. And he would define living things as anything that's moving. Very much different than how Walter Bradley defined it earlier last night. These flow systems have two basic properties that we need to think about. One is the current. What is the current that's flowing through it? It may be fluid or heat, mass, or Adrian Bijan is very ready to consider abstract flows, such as ideas, the flow of information. And so he's not opposed to thinking in the flow of non-material objects too. So there's the current, what is that's flowing, and there's also the design through which it flows, or the configuration, or the conduit, which may be changing with time. And this is the whole idea behind this constructal law, is how this flow influences and interacts with the surroundings and the conduit through which it flows.
Okay, I'm going to stop it there, but you saw what he was talking about. And by system, he means anything that has flow is a living system.
Okay.
So I'm a human being. We have flow from our brain down through our neural system down into our bodies, and our body perceptual back up to the brain and all that. That's a flow.
Okay.
Lightning is a flow. Trees have a flow of water from the ground up through the tree, and then there's a lot of different flow systems in a tree, and all these fractal systems are it's not only what is flowing through the system, but it's also the design through which it flows. So the design impacts the flow, obviously.
Right.
And then the flow and the design also have some sort of impact on the environment in which the design is existing.
Right.
So a tree has an impact on the air around it. And the roots of a tree have an impact on the ground in which the roots are. And so the flow that's moving through the system is simultaneously impacting the environment.
Well, and that makes me think of, I loved your anecdote. I think it was it when you were talking with Jordan Hall the other day about doing a painting for a fundraiser?
Uh-huh.
You got that video? And you talked about how every people would come up and do strokes and whatever, and then you would integrate them into the painting as you were evolving it, right? And it's like everything in some manner was influencing everything. Even I assume even areas in different parts of the canvas ultimately are influencing the whole picture, which is then influencing back out to the little individual parts, right?
Yes, and actually each person who comes up and makes a mark is obviously influenced by what's already on the canvas. I mean, you might think each person is told, come and make a random mark.
Right.
They would just come in blindfolded and make a random mark or something, but they're not blindfolded.
Right.
They're seeing everything that's there, and that whether they know it or not, that's influencing their action. And maybe they're choosing a different color because they see, oh, there's a whole lot of red already, so I want to do something different because I want to be different. And some people will just put a splash of paint on, but some people, they want to draw some kind of an intricate little heart, or they want to make a tree, or they want to make a smiley face. They want something to represent their personality. And so every person is influenced by everything that's there. And then at the end, I'm influenced by everything that's there to try to take this whole big mess and bring it back down into a more compressed form so that there's some kind of platonic form to the thing.
Yeah, you're making meaning out of it.
So
You're
yeah, so it makes sense to people.
the creator that's above,
Mm-hmm.
that's that's interacting with all the little creatures below. Like, I mean, that's a really condescending way to put it, but like that's the pattern, right?
Yeah, so I want to show you something else in this same video. I'm going to go to just to show you what's on the screen at this point. I don't want to play the video because they get off into a lot of other stuff, but I don't know if you can see this very clearly.
I can read
But
it.
he says, if I were to add two words to the constructal law, they would be these: given freedom. For bad ideas make it harder for human beings to thrive. And one of the examples that they're using when they're talking is about how, like, the communist system of forcing people to do what they want you to do, that makes it much harder for human beings to thrive. So a prerequisite then is for the flow system to be free to morph. The emerging flow architecture, which I think is what we're looking at in all your trees of behavior there.
It's a flow.
Emerging flow architecture is the means by which the flow system achieves its objectives under constraints. Then he says freedom is good for design. But I find that very ironic. The last sentence is freedom is good for design, and it's almost as though he didn't notice that the emerging flow architecture is the means by which the flow system achieves its objectives under constraints. So the constraints are what allow the flow system to achieve its objectives, or is at least part of what is allowing the system to achieve its objectives.
Yeah.
And so when it says freedom is good for design, that's a different kind of freedom than you normally think of. This is a freedom within constraints.
What, man, okay. I have so much I'm thinking about now that you said that, because what I'm thinking about is like, okay, what if the body were not constrained at all? It was just kind of autonomously sort of doing whatever it felt like. Well, I'd end up contorting into ways that the body would just snap, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you have the mind controlling it, and the mind is constraining it, right? Like if I were to like try to like contort myself, my mind is gonna create a sensation of, well, I mean, the mind is not even doing it necessarily. I mean, it's the balance between left and right and front and back, right? Like if I, try to do this, like the muscles are inherently built in such a way to where they're creating the tension, they're creating the
Mm-hmm.
constraint. Like it's a self-balancing system, but then you've also got the mind balancing the decisions of the body and vice versa, right? Where it's like,
Mm-hmm.
in some sense, the mind is constraining the body, and the way it constrains is by creating stress, right? Like the stress is the good constraint that says, hey, we've reached a boundary, or we've reached a moment where we need to stop and like recalibrate things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I bring that up because I've been thinking, like, my angle on this stuff is always ultimately psychology and counseling and stuff, because it's like we tend to think of stress as like just a bad thing. I just want to get rid of it. But like in some manner, it is the good constraint we need in order to know where the boundaries are,
Yes.
right? But we don't want to see it that way because we want total freedom, I guess. And especially in our culture, like the more we see pain as inherently bad and stress as inherently bad and try to remove it at all cost, well, you're removing that constraint, which is telling you where the boundaries are that are inherent to reality.
Mm-hmm.
Like if I'm exhausted and my mind is telling me like you can't keep going, like you need to sleep. And if I just take, just keep drinking coffee and keep doing whatever to like force through that constraint, well, now that's like in those diagrams, the red and the blue are no longer listening to each other, you know, because
Mm-hmm.
they need to be talking to each other and creating stress, whether the body is creating stress by muscles or the mind is creating stress by its kind of what it's doing. Its attempts to communicate, hey, we've listened to me. I have something to say about this is bad, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And then it's like, what happens when that system goes haywire? And I think that's essentially what psychopathology is.
when the system stops listening to the stress. Is that what you mean? When it goes
Yeah,
haywire?
something like that. I mean, it stops listening appropriately and responding appropriately to the stress. I'd have to think
Because
about that.
like you said, it can go both ways. You can strive so hard not to have any stress that you
Right.
take all the creativity out of the system.
Mhm.
Or you can strive so hard to have all stress. So there's some level at which, and this takes me back to this idea that my daughter told me about years ago called hormesis, Hormesis, which is that, and this is probably true of everything, but in hormesis, I'm just going to relate it to the human body, that we need a certain amount of stress, different kinds of stressors, to actually keep our body functional. They sort of keep the immune system like in training,
Right.
sort of. So even small amounts of toxins are good for the system because they train your system to kind of overproduce healthy,
Yeah.
and small amounts of tearing. When you're exercising, you're tearing your muscles a little bit, and then
Right.
you give yourself a day to recuperate. And what that does, those little tears, when they rebuild stronger. So all those little stressors, there's all kinds of little stressors like that. I mean, a lot of these people now that jump into ice cold water, they're trying to produce a hormesis so that that little stressor will cause the body to become stronger. And so that's the idea, that we need some stress, we need some variations. That's why I mentioned on the picture where the blue marker is doing its thing and the green marker is trying to keep over the dot, but because it cannot perfectly stay over the dot, that creates some variations, but those variations are part of what
Well,
make it work.
I just now thought about this, but like you could think of it as the variations are the representation of the stress,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because the variation is a reflection of the fact that it's not over the dot, or you could see it backwards, where it's like the fact that it's not over the dot is a reflection of the variation, right? And so depending on which one you see, like the way I framed it earlier was the green marker is not in control. The blue marker is in control. That's a very, it's almost like, let's say the blue is humans and the green is God. I was framing it from the human perspective. But you could also frame it from God's perspective and say, well, green is deciding where that dot's going to go, right? And that variation is going to be, that variation of the mirroring is going to represent what green has decided about the relationship between the dot and the knot, right?
Wow,
I
I
don't.
hadn't thought about it in those terms, but let's flip it and say that blue is God, and that part of what we're doing in trying to, in the article, they talk about the hierarchical value system.
Mhm.
So if we're doing the Jordan Peterson thing of trying to keep our eyes on the highest good of which we can conceive, or keep our eyes on God,
Right.
and we're making the assumption that God wants us to align with him by keeping our dot above his dot.
Mhm.
Or maybe, I guess you could say, maybe the dot in this picture would be more like God, and the blue marker is the things in life that are trying to pull us off the dot. But if we're the green guy and we're trying to stay above the dot, it's all of our reactions to whatever in the world is pulling us off balance.
Mhm.
Those are all our reactions in trying to stay
Mhm.
above the dot. And you have to make the assumption that the dot is the good thing.
Yeah.
You have to make the assumption that the dot is the highest value.
Right.
And, when Peterson always says that without value, it's impossible to move at all, what he means is if you don't think that something is better than something else, you wouldn't bother.
Right.
Which I think you can drive all the way down to the very beginning of life. Why is there life rather than no life? Because the very first cell, and this I'm anthropomorphizing, but it had to make a decision to live.
Right.
It had to make a decision that living, continuing, replicating is better than not living, not replicating.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, there wouldn't be any living and replicating. So, I mean, there has to be a better.
Yeah.
And that better is to stay in homeostasis,
Right.
whatever that means. But in order for there to be homeostasis, I mean, people say, well, it's just a thermostat.
Yeah.
Okay, but a thermostat isn't just a thermostat. Somebody programmed the thermostat, somebody put the set point into the thermostat,
Yep.
and then the thermostat is attempting to stay on that set point.
Yep.
But because the set point is better, because that's aligning with what the thermostat is set for, but somebody had to set the thermostat, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. So this is exactly, we had a previous conversation where I described that I had this experience where I got into physics, like particle physics, and I had this weird kind of mystical thing where I felt like suddenly everything was flipped and I saw God in the particles. I think is how I described it.
Mm-hmm.
It was basically this. It's almost like I had been seeing from the perspective of the blue marker as the only one with will, and the green was just like whatever, just kind of
Mm-hmm.
this emergent, autonomous phenomena thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's like I had this moment where it all reversed in my head, and suddenly I was seeing it from Green's perspective, and like, oh my goodness, like you're saying, why is it that I walk around? Well, it's because there's such a thing as uprightness. That's the set, that's the control for me being able to move, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why do I exist in such a world to where there is such a thing as uprightness, And you could say, like a materialist would say, well, that's just an emergent byproduct of gravity. But it's like, but no, you're seeing it upside down. Why do I exist in such a world where there is such a thing as gravity that results in something like uprightness? Like,
Mm-hmm.
you can't just like, and I mean, this is kind of, I think, the core uh, beef. It's like, are you choosing to see it from bottom up or top down? And it's like, you meet in the middle, and that doesn't solve the problem because okay, now you've met in the middle, and you still have to decide: are you going to see it from the top or the bottom, or are you going to see the whole system, or what? You
Mm-hmm.
know. And I wonder if I don't know. I wonder if the world is headed for some weird situation where we do meet in the middle, and then people are just fundamentally not able to talk to each other because it's like to a materialist, it'll seem obvious. Okay, we've described the whole system. Why aren't you all materialists? And religious people will say, okay, we've mapped the whole system. Like, why don't you people believe in God now? And it's like,
Uh-huh.
it's really interesting. And you have to accept that it is, in some manner, it is two autonomous systems that are dialoguing with each other. Like, it really is a dialogue between God and his creation. And you can see it purely from the perspective of creation, or you can see it purely from the perspective of God. Or you can kind of try to feel into seeing the whole system, but it gets very difficult, you
I
know?
wonder if you could bring the paper back up because I found the quote that I pulled from there, and maybe
Yeah.
you
If
could
you have
use
it pulled up
your search.
already, you can
You
just
could use your
try.
search thing.
Okay. You want me to share screen, you're saying?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Let me take off my share screen. Um, so it was just before section 3,
Okay.
and it says, yeah, you have to scroll up quite a ways, I think.
I can also just search words if you want.
Well, Bayesian belief updating was in parentheses in that section.
This, yeah, right here.
Okay, according to active, right here in the center, this paragraph, according to active inference theory, organisms can not only reduce prediction errors by varying motor output impacting on percepts, as perceptual control would have it, but also by updating their world models to produce a better fit with their input states. This is a process called Bayesian belief updating. So to me, what that paragraph is saying is that well, you have to change it. You can, if you change your worldview, you have two choices. You can either vary your motor output so that some people will go out and they'll start marching with a sign because they're going to change the world.
Yep.
But maybe that isn't, maybe that's the worldview that doesn't actually function. If you go out marching with your signs, that's not actually changing the world. But you can update your world model to produce a better fit with the input states, with what reality actually is.
Yep.
And then you're not going out there marching with signs anymore. You're just trying to grow and mature in yourself so that you are a better person within the system.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, to me, that's a simpler way of stating that.
Yeah.
But part of the problem comes in, so this comes back to chaos theory, right? With chaos theory, the very smallest, minutest error in the starting, maybe not error, just minutest difference in the starting conditions is going to produce an unpredictable outcome.
Right.
And there were people who said, well, yes, it's unpredictable in that you have to just follow the program all the way out, but it's not random. It's unpredictable, but it's not random. So it could still be deterministic, but it's unpredictable. But then I told you that the algorithm fed me up two different things today that fit this. And I don't know why this happens, but because this paper that you sent me is like so far outside my,
right.
I don't know what I would call it, just outside my world. And then the algorithm,
it's not part of your little small world network.
Yes, right. It's not part of my typical small world network. I got a Substack from a guy named Bobby Azarian.
Okay.
And he's talking about chaotic systems. And he says, if you put the measured value of a chaotic system's position into a computer, you have to round that figure to some finite number of decimal places. Because if you're trying to put any sort of a measured value, you have to round it. You have to, because it's a finite, we're in a finite world. So you round the figure to some finite number of decimal places, and just that tiny bit of error, because measurement can never be completely precise. So just that tiny bit of error you get is enough to completely throw off the accuracy of the prediction of the system's future state. And why is that? Because with chaotic systems, which have dynamics that involve feedback loops, that small error gets quickly amplified, and fluctuations inside the system can get magnified, producing completely unpredictable behavior. So this is why it's impossible for the dot to ever stay, the knot in the rubber band to stay above the dot. Yeah. Because perfect measurement is impossible in a finite world.
Yeah.
And there's always going to be, even just because we're all of these different flow states that I was showing, that it could be a tree, it can be lightning, it can be a social network. It can be the flow of water. But anytime that there is a slight imprecision in the input, then the output is going to be unpredictable. So absolutely free will is necessary.
Oh, gosh, man, what I just thought about as you're saying that is like, it's almost like this is a kind of like the three body problem in a sense. Like you've got the dot, and then you've got the two, like, let's say that the blue is responding to the tension in the rubber band, and the green is responding to the location of the dot in reference to the knot.
Mm-hmm.
They are both making decisions constantly with respect to the information that is being influenced by the decision of the other, right? And
Mm-hmm.
like, even if you were to totally deterministically, like, let's say you had a robot controlling each of them, and like the robot for the blue was purely responding to the tension, and the robot for the green was purely responding to the location of the knot. It's like, I wonder if you would find that you have a kind of three body problem where you can't perfectly compute like what's happening there.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make any sense at all?
Yes, it does. But I'm also thinking that if, let's say blue, and let's say you have a robot and you tell blue, you need to draw this thing, and you give it you program it to draw this thing. But because there's tension on that rubber band, the robot's drawing cannot be perfect.
Right.
Because green is responding, trying to keep the knot over the dot. So green's tension is pulling it off just enough. Even if that robot is as precise as it can try to be, it's never going to be that perfect image.
Mm-hmm.
And then green's responding image that happens just by trying to stay above the dot is going to be even less precise than the original image. It has
Right.
to work that way.
And that's somehow like fundamental to, I mean, like life, it seems, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you take this paper as a reasonably compelling argument for like this is essentially how life has to work, then yeah, you essentially have to have these two dialoguing things that are constantly going to create error in each other or create variation in each other. And so, yeah, you're never going to get this kind of perfect homeostasis.
So scroll back up to the beginning of the paper, and we will see
This thing, or like all the way at the beginning?
all the way to the beginning in the introduction at the abstract here.
Okay.
Okay. So in this paper, we show that organisms can be modeled as hierarchical Bayesian control systems with small world and information bottleneck Bowtie network structure. Okay, we went over that part.
Yeah.
Such systems combine hierarchical perception with hierarchical goal setting and hierarchical action control. So goal setting is an important part of this thing, right?
Yeah.
Then we argue that hierarchical Bayesian control systems produce deep hierarchies of goal states. That's all the levels.
Yeah.
From which it follows that organisms must have some form of highest goals. That's where I got this idea that there has to be a value hierarchy, right?
Yeah.
So what this paper is saying is Jordan Peterson was right. Now
Yeah.
these guys might say, oh, Jordan Peterson's a grifter or whatever, but they just proved it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and so yeah, I wonder, I mean, I I have a lot of thoughts about that.
And then just go down a little bit further. And it says, we show that goal hierarchies tend to decompose in a top-down manner under severe and prolonged levels of stress. Prolonged and levels of stress affect the whoever's at the top. Like, let's say it's my brain. Okay, my brain is controlling my body, but under prolonged levels of stress, it starts to decompose from the top. And then this produces behavior that favors short-term and self-referential goals over the long-term social and normative goals. the collapse of goal hierarchies, which is what's happening in the world today, is universally accompanied by an increase in entropy or disorder in control systems that can serve as an early warning sign for tipping points, disease or death of the organism, the fall of the Roman Empire, okay? In humans, learning goal hierarchies corresponds to personality development or maturation. So in order to mature, you have to learn levels of goal hierarchies. You have to learn to manage all your different levels of desires.
Yeah.
And the failure of goal hierarchies to mature properly corresponds to personality deficits. That's where you were talking about psychopathology.
Yep.
So a top-down collapse of such hierarchies under stress is identified as a common factor in all forms of episodic mental disorders.
Yep.
So yeah, now I think I understand the paper.
Yeah. And I mean, and it's framed, you know, he needed to get it published in a paper, so he had to frame it in one context. But like, clearly, he is describing the patterns of all. Okay, not clearly. I think he's describing the patterns of all levels. You know, I mean, like you were talking about, it's like whatever psychopathology is in a brain. Well, a brain is a way to map this structure of life, but like the whole internet is the same thing in a different way. I mean, kind of like Jonathan Pajot talks about, like a city has a body, right?
Mm-hmm.
A city has a body and a mind. So a city is going to have these bow tie structures in terms of how information's passing around. I mean, quite literally, a city has a center, you know, and whatever's happening in that center is going to influence the rest of it. And so it's like the implications of this are that like whatever structures you can see in the human brain or in any information living system, I guess, you're going to see in communities and in families and everything in the global ecosystem, you know?
Because what you're describing when you're saying that this is at all scales,
Mm-hmm.
it drives all the way down to the bottom of,
Yes.
of
And that's what I started to see when I met Gabe Stuckey. And
mhm.
that's why, because I've never cared about physics and chemistry and stuff, but like when I looked at what he was doing, I realized he's doing the same stuff that I'm looking at in terms of like psychology, which blew my mind. And I was like not ready to see that, you know? But here we are.
Yeah, well, if I could, oh man. So here's the metabolic pathway chart. And I'm going to show you what happens when you click on this. You can see all of this information here. And you can scroll around, and all of this is what's going on in metabolism. All of this. It's just crazy. So I'll put a link to this in the video, and this is what I promised to show you, so I did. Maybe I'll find it later and try to stick it into the video.
I think,
When you started talking to Gabe Stuckey, it got you interested in the physics thing.
yeah, yeah. And so I can talk a little bit about, I mean, like, I think what's exciting for me about all this is that, you know, because my gut has always been like, you know, we've talked about my kind of distaste for like the DSM, for example, and how um it just doesn't make sense to me that psychopathology would just be a bunch of random stuff that can happen. Like it just deep in my being, I feel the need to see that like no, there has to be some structure to this. There has to be some explanation for how these things are emergent according to, you know, patterns that I believe are probably pretty simple when you get down to it. Okay, that might actually be something I want to show. So The main author for this paper, I think, is doing some really interesting work. He's he's Dutch, and so I can't understand a lot of what he publishes. Um, I would love it if he'd be willing to have a conversation with you. That'd be like my dream. But
Does he
he's
speak English?
I don't know. I haven't been able to find videos of him talking or anything. Man, I don't know. I might not be able to find what I'm looking for, but he's doing some really interesting stuff
Well,
with.
this is the guy that wrote the paper we were just going over.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
But basically, somewhere on his site, he's got a thing where he's doing what I talked about. He basically said he took a big data set and somehow used it to show that like all psychopathologies can be explained in like in terms of like six. I think he basically said like six you know fundamental principles or something. I can't remember the terminology he used, but like essentially it's not all random. It's all structural, and there's a structural, reasonable explanation for how all that stuff can happen as a result of imbalances in these six principles, you know? And like that makes perfect sense when you start thinking in these terms about how it all works. It's like, okay, you know, if you need like let's say these two sides that have to compress information and listen to each other. Like let's say those are just the fundamental building blocks of this whole thing. Well, what happens when they're not properly compressing information? What happens when they're not properly listening to each other? What happens when they're not properly perceiving things, you know? It's like any one of those things going wrong would lead to a very particular pattern of something going wrong in that whole system, right? And so it's like, what if you could explain all psychopathology in those terms, right?
I would love to see his analysis of the six hubs or nodes or whatever language he's using for that.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily know that that six maps onto this. My gut is that it probably does in some manner, but like, yeah,
Well, I mean, he may have just been using six in the picture for
right,
ease
exactly.
of drawing it, but it would be really interesting if there are six types of only six types or six centers of psychopathology. That would be very interesting.
Oh, I think it was, no, it wasn't this. I don't know. I'll have to look for it and send it to you later, but
Yeah, so
uh,
we should have another conversation and talk about that, and I'll find the map for you of the cell thing.
yeah, that'd be
Because
great.
I think that would blow, if you've never seen that before, that would blow your mind.
Nice.
I've had it on a number of times when I've been talking to biologists in the past, and because what it goes through is what happens in our, well, let's say in our bodies, what happens in our bodies anytime that there's a percept that comes in from outside. It
Yep.
has to go through all of these things, and the map is massive. I mean, it's like a map of New York City or something. I mean, it's just there's so many different pathways that it's the pathways of all the molecular machinery and what's happening every time a percept comes in, and how it affects all the different hormones, and then the hormones, you know, it's this cascading effect
Mhm.
of everything.
Yeah,
And to imagine that that just evolved without any sort of goal or recognition of a higher level or anything is, it's just
yeah,
completely absurd.
yeah. And I think, you know, I'm thinking about something from this paper where I can't remember the wording he used exactly, and I probably wouldn't be able to find it, but essentially he talks about how, you know, there are these fundamental building blocks, you know, so these motifs, like the bow
Mhm.
tie structure, and it's like that bow tie structure could manifest physically in a lot of different ways, you know. And so one way is, you know, at a very high scale is the brain itself, maybe the two hemispheres with kind of the center and whatever.
Mhm.
But then at smaller scales, you've got the same structure and whatever. And so like, I think a materialist might try to argue, well, it's those structures that are leading to this whole thing. And so at a tiny, tiny particle level, yeah, you've got that going on. And then at the chemical level, you've got that going on and whatever. And so the brain is just the emergence of that structure, right? And so that's the very bottom up view that thinks like, well, I've accounted for the whole system, so whatever, you know. But to your point, it's like, well, why is any of this the way it is to start with? You know?
Yep. Well, let's do it. Let's get back together again, and we'll explore some more of these structures of as Carl Friston would say, the map, that the internal map you have to have of the external world in order to function. Right. Yeah.
Cool. Sounds good.
This has been good. Thank you, Ryan.
Yeah. Thanks, Karen.
Talk again soon. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.